Bienvenidos a esta conferencia magistral con la que continuamos las actividades en celebración de los 50 años de la fundación de la Escuela Graduada de Planificación. Esta ocasión tiene un simbolismo especial porque fue en el mes de abril, específicamente el 30 de abril de 1965, que se aprobó la certificación del Consejo de Educación Superior estableciendo nuestro programa. Desde entonces, el programa se ha solidificado y se ha fortalecido con la acreditación de la Planning Accreditation Board. Al presente, estamos inmersos en un proceso de renovación que incluye una revisión curricular, reclutamiento de profesores e iniciativas de internacionalización. Esta noche nos complace contar con una distinguida visitante, la doctora Isabelle Anguelovski, investigadora de la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona. Agradecemos que haya aceptado nuestra invitación y su disposición para presentarnos su trabajo en torno al tema de justicia ambiental desde una perspectiva holística e internacional y en el que aborda procesos de cambio urbano, medioambientes degradados y problemáticas de desigualdad y exclusión social. A su vez, destaca la acción comunitaria para la reconstrucción de vecindarios habitables. Ha titulado su conferencia, como ven ahí, Backfiring Environmental Justice, Advocacy for the Poor and Minorities, the Exclusionary Dynamics of Municipal Urban Sustainability, Neighborhood Greening, and Climate-Proofing Interventions in the Global North and South. Un título ciertamente provocador para un tema relevante y de actualidad. Esperamos que su análisis genere un intercambio estimulante y que contribuya a una reflexión de nuestra parte sobre las implicaciones de estos procesos para la planificación y, por otro lado, sobre cómo situamos la experiencia de Puerto Rico en este contexto. Aunque la conferencia será en inglés, al final podrán formular sus preguntas, comentarios o reacciones en español o en inglés. La doctora Anguelovski obtuvo un doctorado en planificación urbana y ambiental en MIT. Anteriormente estudió gerencia de organizaciones sin fines de lucro en la Universidad de Harvard y desarrollo internacional en la Sorbona. Su investigación se sitúa en la intersección de la planificación y política urbana, la desigualdad social y los estudios del desarrollo. Actualmente se desempeña como investigadora senior en el Instituto de Ciencias Ambientales y Tecnología de la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona. Sus proyectos de investigación examinan dos dimensiones principales. Primero, exploran el grado en que los planes urbanos y las decisiones de política pública contribuyen a ciudades más justas, resilientes, saludables y sustentables. Segundo, se enfocan en cómo los grupos comunitarios en vecindarios de ingresos bajos resisten y disputan la existencia, creación o exacerbación de inequidades ambientales como resultado de iniciativas de desarrollo o redesarrollo y enverdecimiento urbano. Su libro reciente, publicado por MIT Press en el 2014, se titula Neighborhood as Refuge, Community Reconstruction, Plans, Place Remaking and Environmental Justice in the City. En este libro, la doctora Anguelovski investigó cómo se organizaron los activistas comunitarios en tres vecindarios históricamente marginados, en Boston, La Habana y Barcelona, para mejorar la calidad ambiental local y enfrentar los traumas ambientales, las pérdidas y el temor de los residentes a ser desplazados. Sus proyectos de investigación actuales se enfocan en varios temas que incluyen el aburguesamiento o gentrification ambiental en Río de Janeiro, Medellín, New York y Boston, y en las dimensiones de equidad en adaptación climática urbana en Quito y Surat. Les invito a que se unan a mí para recibir con un aplauso de bienvenida a la doctora Angelovski.
Hola, buenas tardes a todos. Lo siento mucho primero hacer mi conferencia en inglés, me disculpo por esto. Como le comentaba a la doctora Concepción, lo que pasa es que todo mi trabajo lo escribo en inglés, lo discuto en inglés, pero claro, estoy siempre, digamos, los intercambios que tengo los puedo hacer muy fácilmente en castellano. Pero espero que esto no os desanime y espero que, bueno, que pueda ser dinámica a pesar de que hay la conferencia en inglés. Primero quería agradeceros a todos por estar aquí, por invitarme, a la doctora Concepción, por haber iniciado esta invitación creo que hace apenas un mes que, digamos, que la lanzó, y hace un mes estaba en el medio de Barcelona escribiendo papers y de repente a las 9 de la noche recibo esta invitación excelente y me pareció una idea estupenda y bueno, y por eso os agradezco mucho que me tengáis aquí y que hayáis hecho tiempo para mí, para estar aquí hoy con vosotros. Bueno, pues voy a cambiar un poco al inglés ahora, y si tenéis clarificación, dudas durante la presentación, no dudéis en interrumpirme, si no, bueno, habrá tiempo al final para algunas preguntas también. He hecho a propósito la presentación con máxima amplitud geográfica para, digamos, también tener un poco otras perspectivas de justicia ambiental. No tengo ejemplos de Puerto Rico, me disculpo también por esto. La idea era un poquito también compartir con otras realidades urbanas, quizás también os puedan recordar problemas que conocéis mucho mejor que yo, entonces por eso no he incluido ejemplos de Puerto Rico. Vale, pues entonces comienzo en inglés. So the title of my presentation today has to do with environmental justice movements in the global north and the global south, and I'm going to bring in a few cities that will illustrate my argument. The main question that I wanted to pose at the beginning of the presentation, and is a research question, but also a planning challenge, I would say, is the following. How do environmental revitalization, sustainability planning, and climate interventions in cities create conditions for resident displacement and eviction? And my idea here is to show the contradiction between a process that was originally touted as bringing benefits for all, and when the discourse, for instance, of sustainability planning was created in the 1970s and then formalized in the Brundtland Report in 1987, the idea was to have a balance between social benefits, environmental conservation, economic development in the way that sustainability was supposed to be implemented. There were a lot of documents afterwards, Agenda 21, many meetings, many forums, the last one in Rio +20. But actually, the environmental aspect has always taken the priority, and many times we have forgotten to look at whether or not initiatives that are supposed to make cities more sustainable, more green, more climate resilient, which is, the examples I'm going to develop today, are actually benefiting equally all groups of societies. Are the blacks in New York, in the neighborhood of Harlem, benefiting as well as higher income white residents from plans such as the sustainability plan NYC, for instance, Or is there actually some inequalities that are created by the process of urban sustainability? So that's the general question that I'm posing. The outline of the presentation is the following. I'm going to briefly go over the history and the evolution of the environmental justice movement in the US and beyond, to show a little bit how this movement transformed over time in its discourse and in its goals, I would say. Then I'm going to look a little bit at some theory, because I'm in an academic environment surrounded by peers who also care to a certain extent about theory. So I want to talk here about the recent emergence of what is called the environmental gentrification literature, which is a little bit, in a way, of a contradiction, but I want to try to share with you why environmental justification has become both something of scholarly interest, but also a big challenge for activists. And then I'm also going to turn to some case studies of displacement and exclusion in urban greening, and then conclude with some planning implications of neighborhood greening, revitalization and sustainability projects. My main argument, so that if I bore everyone to death within the next 10 minutes, maybe at least you keep the slide number 3 in mind. So the main argument is that projects such as green belts, parks, healthy food stores, climate-proofing infrastructure, you name it, the waterfront, have actually come to be locally unwanted land uses, so LULUs, in racially mixed neighborhoods. You would think at first that they are desirable, but my argument, which I think is, I don't want to make everyone uncomfortable, but I think it's an uncomfortable thought, is that actually such improvements that are against greening the neighborhood are actually undesirable in racially mixed neighborhoods. And why is it the case? Because such projects create conditions for city rebranding, reinvestment, and the social spatial exclusion and invisibilization of the most socially and racially vulnerable residents, their livelihoods and practices. And I'm talking here about realities both, I would say, in cities in the global north and in the global south. This type of exclusionary process is not just linked to North America. And it creates a form of environmental privilege, which is, in the end, the exclusive access that wider and wealthier residents have or will tend to have to environmental goods and amenities that are created to supposedly improve a neighborhood. So, just briefly, some background of the environmental justice movement. Okay. So the first visible and widely reported environmental justice struggles in the United States were initiated in the 1970s at the very end and early 1980s. The first well-known one was Love Canal in the north of the country, where white residents were protested against the dumping under their houses and schools of contaminants and the impact on the health of their kids. This image here is from Warren County, North Carolina, which brought an added racial dimension to environmental burdens impacting historically marginalized groups. Because this struggle, you see the people lying on the streets, were black residents who were exposed to PCBs, highly contaminated materials, on the back roads, on their gardens of their cities, and that confronted legislators for allowing those PCBs to be dumped in their backyard, and for also showing how racially marginalized groups, in the case black in the American South, were more targeted by environmental risk, environmental impacts than whiter and wealthier residents. So if you want just quick definition of environmental justice, it's generally quite clear. It is the fact that poor and minority residents tend to suffer to a greater extent from environmental risks and environmental toxics, unsafe working conditions, and resource extraction in comparison with whiter and wealthier residents. This type of argument is based on statistical research, especially in epidemiology, that has happened at various levels, from national studies at larger levels of population, spatial segregation, to studies in very specific states or in very specific cities, all showing discrepancy in exposure to risks and to contaminants. The other part of the environmental justice literature has to do with process. Inequities are not just happening because of unequal application of the law, they also happen because of unequal participation in decision-making of affected population and of unequal forums of participations for them. So if you take this, if you take this graph here, which is extracted by a very famous study conducted by Robert Bullock, so basically the founder of the environmental justice movement, released in 2007, based on 2000 census data, it is very clear about this process of unequal exposure. this graph shows that that areas that have clustered toxic facilities are populated by 69% by all people of color. Non-clustered facilities by 51%. And if you disaggregate the data by people, by types of minorities, you will see that, for instance, 29% of the residents that live around clustered facilities are African Americans, 33% are Hispanic or Latinos, 4% are Asian and Islanders, Pacific Islanders. So again, here a very clear statistical demonstration of inequalities in exposure to toxic facilities. What has happened with the environmental justice movement, and I understand that this is a huge leap in time, is that since the initial disputes and since the initial struggles in the 1980s, the movement had expanded its scope and its interest. It moved from fighting against brown contamination and toxic facilities to looking more at a proactive way of asking for improvements in neighborhood conditions, not just thinking about I'm fighting against something, against a very specific sources of pollution, but I want to make my neighborhood less abandoned, less burdened by blight. I want to make it more sustainable in the long term. So that has meant that the environmental justice agenda has really complexified and became much more holistic in the 2000s, over the, let's say, I would say the past 15 years. So here, the idea was to fight then around several domains. The domains of transit justice. The idea here is that all people, regardless of their race and their income, have the right to well-connected, affordable, and clean transit systems, not just to poorly connected, contaminating diesel buses in the suburbs of Los Angeles, for instance. Everyone has the right to healthy, fresh, local, and affordable food. So this was the movement that has been very strong in the United States and abroad around food justice and food sovereignty. Housing also has become part of the equation. All people have the right to green, affordable, and healthy housing. And this is related also to giving funding for jobs and training that is related to energy efficiency and weatherizing projects. So when the green economy started to become stronger towards the end of the 2000s, many groups have applied for grants from the federal government and from the state government to improve the energy efficiency of their houses, but also to become trained in the green economy. All of this to say that the environmental justice agenda for urban marginalized neighborhoods has become much stronger and has brought together groups and organizations that are not just fighting against one issue, but are really complementing their work over time with each other. This also then shows you that the environment is definitely redefined as the place where people live, work, learn, and play all together, which is a traditional movement, which is a traditional slogan of the environmental justice movement. And it shows also that this environmental justice struggle is connected to fights for social and economic justice, community wealth creation, equitable redistribution of resources, employee ownership, alternative local economic development, you name them. You might be saying, wow, she's talking about everything on the planet here. Well, what's happening is that in order to have long-term environmental quality in neighborhoods of color and historically marginalized neighborhoods, it's not just sufficient to have a park. You have to also want to enjoy this park. So for instance, you need to not have crime in the neighborhood or drug dealing. You also need to maybe have families who feel safe about sending their kids to the park. So it's all connected to each other. So to illustrate this argument about the fact that the environmental justice movement has complexified its agenda over the last 15 years, I'm going to bring in some cases of environmental neighborhood gentrification, which are the three neighborhoods that I talk about in the book. But I'm not actually touching upon all of them. I'm just talking about Cascantic in Barcelona and Cayo Hueso in Havana. I have other examples about the US, and I thought I wasn't necessarily just having a US-centered presentation. But the commonality of the three case studies is that they have all moved from getting rid of contaminants in the soil to cleaning up the lots or redeveloping the vacant lots in practices that are much more green, that are much more safe, and that also provide economic benefits for families. So for instance, urban farms, community gardens, gyms, all type of, let's say, more environmental health related opportunities that, at the same time as they enhance physical health, they also have an impact on broader, self-esteem, empowerment, etc. So this is what I call holistic environmental revitalization action. Residents together with non-profits, supported by foundations, universities, have moved from removing contamination to cleaning up of the land, focusing on nutrition, economic savings, also using green space to provide after-school sports facilities with educational and physical benefits. They have created on their own new parks, playgrounds, community centers around safe play and recreation. They also have created very interesting forms of green spaces that have learning in them. So for instance, in one of the neighborhoods, which is a dirty neighborhood in Boston, many of the schoolyards, so basically the patios that are in the backgrounds of the schools, were unused, and actually very often they were dumping sites for contractors that were coming from all around the city of Boston, dumping their old refrigerators or their old oil or whatever type of trash they could imagine into the schoolyards of primary schools or secondary schools. So residents obviously found that completely outrageous, and I'm talking here about the middle of the 1980s. And the city, rather than, pursuing legally and fining the offenders, just basically closed their eyes on the whole process. So residents had to really, what I call in the book, undergo through a process of bricolage in Spanish, so bricolage, and collage techniques to bring resources together, non-material resources together, and material resources together to clean up the lots and transform these heavily contaminated schoolyards into actually schoolyards with ponds, with educational plants, with beds, with tables, where actually not only was that a place of higher environmental quality, but it was also a place for learning. So what would happen, for instance, and what still happens, is that teachers come and they have a session on creative writing during an English class in the schoolyard, and the students, instead of being in front of their desk, like you all, bored and not knowing exactly what they would write about, will have this inspirational environment in their backyard to go through a creative learning exercise, creative writing exercise. That's just an example of how you associate different components of greening and revitalization together to create a much more holistic purpose for the facility. And then finally, the combination also of this type of revitalization with affordable habitats and local jobs. And everything is connected here, from brown to green environmental justice. So I'm giving you an example a bit more in depth here, which is the Casc Antic of Barcelona. In this area of Barcelona, which is the old town, the district where the Casc Antic is located is full of mazes and small streets that also have a lot of plazas, so you can think a lot about the architecture of the old San Juan. And small stores and also workshops usually occupy the ground floor of buildings, while the upper floors are for housing and at times office spaces. The name of the streets often reflects former type of oficios, so businesses that were created in the neighborhood during the Middle Ages and much later, so cotoners, cotton makers, flasaders, blanket makers, etc. This has historically been a neighborhood that was considered highly marginalized, lots of drug addiction, waste and debris accumulation, the lowest life expectancy in the city, and that was abandoned for many years by the dictatorship of Franco until 1975, and then also later, during the first years of the transition to democracy at the beginning of the 1980s, it was not an area that was pleasant at all to occupy. So for instance, still actually in 1999, 64% of the buildings of this area were considered as not viable and in not adequate conditions of living. And what happened between 1999 and let's say now is that residents have come together to really transform the environmental quality of the neighborhood through community gardens, through playgrounds, through workshops with kids. And they have used the ability of residents to connect with each other, to have a very strong attachment to their place, to bring residents together, to bring others together. And they also have confronted the municipality of Barcelona, which had planned to construct a few 4- and 5-star hotels in the area as well as parkings. So they have confronted the area of the desire of a city to very much market their place as a residence for tourists rather than a place for higher quality of life of Pakistani, Latino, North Africans, and South Asian residents. And now I would say this is an area that is both diverse and of high environmental quality. My second example is Cayo Hueso, Havana. So Cayo Hueso, Havana is a neighborhood in Centro Havana, so in the middle of Havana. It's not as historically preserved as Havana Vieja, but it is still an area of historic importance. It's an area that was highly neglected during the first few decades of the Castro Revolution because the revolution's goal was to re-equilibrate and balance out the development of the countryside with the development of the city. So you would say that basically Havana was quite neglected during the first few decades of the revolution, and much more emphasis was given to rural productivity, farming practices, and other types of rural development, which led to a massive degradation of building. For instance, in 1988, more than 95% of the buildings of Cayo Hueso were not considered in adequate shape. 14 out of the 17 green and public spaces of the neighborhood were not in visiting conditions. They could not be used. During 80% of the time, people did not have access to potable water and to electricity. Sewage systems were completely collapsed. What happened over the decade of the 1990s and of the 2000s is that Afro-Cuban residents, young alternative youth, community organizations from this Afro-Cuban neighborhood of Cayo Hueso, supported by municipalities of Spain, actually also there were some Puerto Rican organizations working there, came together to bring in long-lasting environmental quality through the neighborhood, through various environmental and health improvement. So you can see here on the left, the example of a green street, that's called the Callejón de Jamel, which brings together new greenery, new green space, and artwork for the improvement of the environmental quality of the neighborhood, but also for the conservation of the Afro-Cuban identity. Cayo Hueso also is the only neighborhood of Havana, of central Havana, that has an urban farm, high productivity urban farm. There's also empty space that has been used now for different sports activity. So all of this to say that environmental justice activism, so the idea again that lower income residents and minority residents have the right to a higher quality of life, a higher environmental quality, all of this has come to exist because of a strong capacity to rebuild a broken community, an abandoned community, and to use the identity and the place attachment dimension of the place. And that's, in a way, what the book contribution is about, is looking at how place connection and lived experiences of residents and their supporters in these three neighborhoods of Dudley, Boston, Cayo Hueso, Havana, Cascantic, Barcelona, how these experiences that are both negative, of abandonment, of blight, of poor environmental quality, so what I call environmental trauma, loss, and grief, also are actually associated with positive experiences linked to social networking in the place, linked to very strong community ties, linked to a very strong association with architecture, with the planning history of the place, with the local traditions of the place, and a very strong sense of belonging. All of this comes together, so the negative aspect and the positive aspect kind of get reconciled and combined towards greater community engagement, combined also with some reinforcing motivators, which I call the sense of responsibility of residents, the desire of personal growth through being involved inside a community garden or a lot cleaning workshop, and also a strong commitment to environmental quality. All of this together to rebuild a degraded and oftentimes a devastated neighborhood and create what I write here on the right side of the diagram. They are able, through their activism over time, to bring environmental recovery and rootedness for residents. They create refugee and safe havens. So this urban farm, for instance, that I showed you in the previous slide, it's not just a place where human residents can have access to fresh and affordable food, which was a huge problem, as we know, during the special period crisis. It is also a place where they can actually talk about other forms of identity, other forms of interest, where they can plan, for instance, a community cultural workshop, where they can think about an activity for children after school. So it's a refuge, as they say. It's a safe haven where they are protected from outside eyes, being either white eyes that, you know, they consider that, I mean, Cuba is also a racist society per se, it's not just the American society, where they actually feel safe and where they feel that they can protect their identity. They recreate an urban village and they celebrate the different features of the community, which was very obvious in the previous image of the artistic street. They bring together memory and identity. So just to conclude on this positive aspect of environmental justice, what these different projects of, you know, urban farms, community gardens, parks, playgrounds, community centers, you name them, all of this, what they do is that they improve, on the one hand, the physical health of the neighborhoods, the tangible, let's say physical, tangible improvements, clean air and soil, nutrition, improvements in safe play, recreation and education, physical activity, healthy home and habitat, but also they really have a very strong mental health component, which is a dimension that we forget very much generally in the environmental justice work. You know, we think about what are the concrete statistics that have been improved. Well, residents now have access to 10 pounds of tomatoes per week for that amount of money rather than, you know, 2 pounds before. No, it's actually much stronger than that. In order for these improvements to be kept over time, residents also have, you know, healed. They have become more protected. There's a dimension of wellness and nurturing that just goes much beyond the body, and that is able to remake a more traumatized community and build safe havens and refuge over time. And it shows how important it is to connect environmental justice and community development. Are and that is where kind of this is a transition to the second part of my presentation, such improvements over time are actually in jeopardy and are being endangered by this new phenomenon that is called environmental gentrification. And so it creates this conundrum for activists between, should I actually invest time in improving the environmental quality of my neighborhood if actually later on a planner is going to come or a luxury developer is going to come and build a huge skyscraper next to my house because actually now they think that it's fancy and funky to be living next to a community garden. So again, here's the second part of the presentation, the emergence of green inequity and environmental gentrification. So what is the definition, first of all, of environmental or ecological gentrification? This definition has to do with the fact that urban environmental transformations and improvements, such as the one I was talking to you about earlier, are intertwined with inequity, reformation, and gentrification. That they are not neutral processes, and that waste sites are actually now sites of reinvestment and value creation as they get slowly transformed from industrial and contaminated sites to sites for cleanup, transformation, and profit-making. So what is environmental gentrification? Here is the official definition by Sarah Dooling from 2009. It is the implementation of an environmental planning agenda related to public green space that leads to the displacement or exclusion of the most economically vulnerable population while espousing an environmental ethic. And that's very important, this last part, while espousing an environmental ethic, because the discourses that municipal decision makers, public officials, mayors, planners have around greening and have around sustainability is very positive. It's a win-win discourse. It will make the city greener, investors will come back to our shrinking or degraded neighborhood, the residents will be all living in better environmental conditions. So the ethic is supposedly very positive, but actually the effects of these greening processes are very pervasive. And the process here shows that private investments, government decisions and policies, classism and racism have come now to include a new variable, neighborhood greening by public and private investors. And that's just some images of, improvements in green spaces in different cities in North America. What I want to insist on here, and it's a slightly obviously different process from the one I was describing earlier, is that this role, the emergence of environmental gentrification has to do with official sustainability planning, because public officials are involved in this reconstruction of a discourse and of an image of their cities. And then little by little, they create a new image and they rebrand the cities. So it's based on the fact that, for instance, many cities develop agendas and programs to make cities more green and livable. This is the front cover of Plan NYC, which was the New York Sustainability Plan adopted under the Bloomberg administration. Sustainability plans also include rhetoric around smart growth and complete street. I don't know if you've heard of that through your studies, but it's a new rhetoric that has been put out up there by planners, by elected officials to make, again, cities more livable, more green, more compact, etc. The problem is that this official urban sustainability planning has completely failed up for now to consider the initial conditions of the neighborhood and the vulnerability of a neighborhood to exclusion and displacement as a result of the implementation of projects that have to do with sustainability planning. So if you take the example of Plan NYC in New York, for instance, studies have shown that the residents who live in rent-stabilized units and families who receive governmental assistance are much more vulnerable to sustainability planning and to being forced out of their neighborhood because their rents actually become, shuffle again towards the upper part and have no other choice than moving out. An example of this sustainability planning, Claiborne Avenue in New Orleans. Claiborne Avenue had this overpass, as you can see here. This overpass that was built in the 60s that actually decimated a black business corridor in order to build this highway that was supposed to bring very quickly white residents from the suburbs here to work in downtown New Orleans. The problem is that it split this neighborhood of Treme here in two parts. Now, actually, 40 years later, the mayor of New Orleans has this idea of constructing a green corridor in Treme and removing the overpass, and he calls Claiborne Avenue the future most complete street in the world. But a restored Claiborne Avenue would be very attractive and would enhance the economic potential of the immediate Claiborne Avenue corridor. With the idea, obviously here, not maybe as obvious to everyone, but the obvious idea here is that this economic corridor is not to be occupied by African American stores, but rather investors who will invest in a completely different form of businesses. Another process of green gentrification, which is the restoration of the Highline Park in New York City. You might have seen it either as it was before, which was a former elevated railroad. In 1999, the process of restoration started, and in 2014, or actually even a little bit before, it has become a large urban park, very much enjoyed and appreciated by visitors, by New Yorkers who come there and can appreciate the beautiful aesthetics of their city by being on an elevated park. There is art that's being produced there, people are having picnics, it's a very used neighborhood feature. The problem is that recent real estate reports have shown that the property values around these new parks have increased by a much higher percentage than the ones that are further away from the park. And the local businesses are very afraid of being put out of business because of their incapacity to sustain rent increases. And they are afraid of being squeezed out. The final example here is the one of Paseo San Joan in Barcelona, in my city, where also a very busy thoroughfare has been transformed into an area that has a much reduced space for cars, and now also a place for for bikes here in the middle, you know, plazas with parks everywhere, playground for kids. So again, it's a green street, but it has an impact on the real estate values and the capacity of traditional residents to stay there. And that's actually also what I'm trying to get at with this idea of green gentrification, is that more and more studies that are done in real estate development and studies using especially hedonic models of economic valuation show that there is in general a 15 to 25% increase in real estate prices after an official greening project seems to have taken place. So obviously this process is not neutral, and if you look at who drives environmental gentrification, you have different actors. Private developers, you know, the ones that invest in the green amenities once the projects have been put in place, elected officials with their discourses around the smart city, the modernization of the city, the removal of, you know, what they call a dirty urban fabric, planners and policymakers by giving tax breaks and zoning decisions that will change the pattern of the neighborhood, that will green it, and that will also allow for the construction of luxury developments next to the new green amenities. And private residents too, because they purchase homes. They also sometimes try to influence the way that green spaces are used. So if you take, for instance, the case of the Marcus Garvey Park in Harlem, it was, the whole area was cleaned up, the park was beautified, was cleaned up, and actually a few months later, the neighborhood associations of a few luxury condos around the park decided that African American drummers who had been practicing drumming for decades in the park actually had no place there, and that they had to be put away, and that the park had to be a park enjoyed in a very different way. So people are actually also, residents are also actually trying to control socially and spatially how new green amenities are being used. And I'm going to go now a little bit more in depth with a few examples of how greening is accompanied by inequity, even though, again, at first, this is not either a desirable consequence nor something that's obviously very publicized. So the first example I'm going to go more in depth is in the case of Medellin in Colombia. To the question. So I have a few case studies, and each case study is accompanied by a question. The first one is, how does city rebranding around green and resilience discourses create displacement and exclusion? So I'm going to go over this phenomenon here. Medellin, Colombia, the second city in Colombia, has received in 2013 the award of being the most innovative city in the world. It's a very interesting new label for a city that is constantly in the process of reinvention after being named one of the most violent cities in the world during the armed conflict of the 1980s and 90s, which had led to many residents of Medellin, but also of the surrounding rural areas, to flee Medellin's center and their rural areas for the outskirts of the cities. Medellin, the city in resurgence, has been illustrated by something that is called urbanismo social, investment in public infrastructure, institution building, and improved transportation infrastructure as well. One of the latest projects that is reinventing Medellin is the Green Belt, the Corredor Verde in Spanish. So you can see Medellin is located in the middle of a long Andean valley, the Aburrá Valley, and it has different levels. The Metropolitan Green Belt is a strategy of growth containment together with a strategy of decreasing the risk of landslides in informal settlements. And it is what the main senior architect of the city calls, it is fundamentally a planning strategy. It is supposed to consolidate the territory in a balanced and equitable way. It is the official vocabulary. So it's a flagship project for the municipality, and it has 3 zones. So the zone in dark green is the zone of protection itself. It's the green belt. It has natural habitat, wildlife preservation, new city parks, beautiful areas for recreation. So zona de protección. Then you have a zone that is in yellow, so the zone in the middle, which is a zone of transition. Zona de transición. It has middle it's in the middle, and it has the highest concentration up to now of residents who often live in quite poor conditions and often lack basic amenities, and these people have spilled beyond the city limits. And then in orange, you have the zone that's called the reconquering zone of the valley. It's a zone of consolidation where actually settlements that have also expanded a little bit above the city limits, beyond the city limits, will actually be consolidated and will also receive new high-rises and infrastructure. The green belt is now going to be an area that will have the length of 74 square kilometers, built on the slopes of the Aburra Valley, and it will be built in 4 phases. The problem is that the green belt has brought up many controversies because of the way it has been branded and because of the way it has been implemented. It is, in a way, trying to forge a new identity for Medellin, but it is also bringing in a lot of conflicts and a lot of, let's say, private investment. So if you can see, for instance, the investment, the first image here, by the investment group Citibank, is actually also branding Medellin as a more green city with a higher quality of life. There is announcement about the Corredor Verde everywhere. Here is actually an image of a park that hasn't been built yet, but you can imagine how it's going to look in the future. However, as this last image shows here, the communities that live most in the peripheries are not very happy about the way that the city is managing the green belt, which is why I call this project a belt of questions. It's not a belt, green belt, it's a belt of questions. So there are several questions that remain to be answered. How will relocation away from unstable terrain be managed? What form will the new housing take place for the residents that are not allowed to stay in the yellow transition zone or in the green zone? How will the city respond to marginalized residents' concern? Many residents are not happy at all with the idea, obviously, of being evicted from the houses they built, especially because they built them during the armed conflict, so they don't want to be displaced again. They also have created gardens on which they rely for their livelihoods and that are based on their traditional identity of indigenous farmers. They don't want to be built into one-size city-built tower blocks. So they would actually obviously prefer to remain in their traditional, low-income, but just maybe one household house rather than being transferred to apartment buildings. Who is the green belt for? It's actually a green belt for tourists and for visitors rather than for people who have lived in the outskirts of Medellin. And finally, what is meant by ordenamiento territorial, because this is the idea of the green belt. Do this territorial ordering. The problem is that what is the social responsibility of the state there? Move people here and there, put a new high-rise tower, bring a new bike lane there, having a new tramway system, when actually we're talking about areas that have been built in a very delicate social historic context of internal conflict. The state has a responsibility towards these people that is way beyond ordenamiento territorial, territorial ordering. And what is important here is to show the inequities in displacement. So this is what one of my studies has shown, which is the fact that neighborhoods from higher stratum, so meaning higher income neighborhoods, can move forward with their urban expansions towards the hills in the southern area of the city, even though they are actually going to be located in green protected reserve. There are aggregated communities that are being built all over Medellin with high towers of apartments and that are sponsored by very prominent construction agencies in the history of Medellin. They also are being funded by private investors with very close links to the mayor. And these gated communities, there is no mention of their need to be resettled. The problem also is that the resettlement of the poor residents are going to make them lose access to the Pal de Azúcar mountain, which they have farmed now for a few decades. The green belt is also supposed to be accompanied by what's called a new mobility corridor. So tramway systems, new metro cables, fast bus systems, bike lanes, that could actually lead to this phenomenon of gentrification I've been talking about, because they are definitely advertised and marketed for tourists, and wealthier residents, rather than for lower income neighborhoods. And actually, public transport itself is not going to necessarily reach the lower income neighborhood. So what I'm showing here, what I'm trying to say here, is that residents who have been historically the most marginalized residents of Medellin are not going to be necessarily the ones who will benefit from the green belt and will be necessarily the ones relocated for lower risk areas. These are a few quotes here from the residents who interviewed in the project. The government is now building palomeras, which are these high-rise buildings for social housing, and wants to force another displacement on these people. The communities are not used to living in buildings of 15, 20 floors, but in single-floor housing. Then another quote from Isabelle, who is leading a group of community activists who are participating in the dialogue process with the government. She says, "Through the social work that we have been doing, we are ready to insist on our proposal in a process of peace. If they negotiate with armed actors at the national level, why can't they do it with us? We don't ask for the police or the army, but for social investment. We are not occupying these slopes because we want to, but because the armed conflict forced us to move there. We don't need a green belt nor an encircling garden. We want the right to live in a dignified way in our territories. We demand the reparation to the victims." So in conclusion of this section, what I'm trying to say is that urban sustainability and resilience planning are now, I would say, the new frontier in the revanchist city agenda. Green infrastructures such as the Green Belt might put a lot of emphasis on the need to promote urban resilience and growth containment, but actually does not consider at all other elements of well-being, including the ability to remain close to family ties and also to remain to have access to livelihoods. Urban sustainability can actually produce displacement and trauma. And actually, containment and beautification of the urban landscape through the greening of poor areas and actually through a form of what I would say land grabbing in the, following a little bit the idea of David Harvey around dispossession, converts these new landscapes into landscapes of pleasure that actually dispossess low-income community from their assets for what is supposedly going to be the greatest public good. Low-income residents here are not going to be replaced only by wealthy newcomers, but also by greenery and by the visitors who come to enjoy it. Another case of inequity, social spatial inequity, is the case of Dhaka, Bangladesh. And here the section is called Climate Adaptation Acts of Omission and Commission, Dhaka, Bangladesh. Dhaka is the capital of Bangladesh. It has 20 million people that are all located in highly flooding-prone area. But Dhaka is surrounded by 4 rivers. It has the largest delta in the world, so you can just imagine the risks that are linked to sea level rise, intense rain, and other extreme weather events. The problem of Dhaka is that also one of the fast-growing cities in the world, with around 300 to 400,000 new migrants coming every year. The other problem of Dhaka is that it doesn't have spatial and regional planning. It only has sectoral planning, meaning that housing plans on its side, transportation plans on its side, health is doing its own business, but there is no idea of how to coherently plan for equitable and sustainable development in the city. So it is actually growing in a very uncontrolled manner, leading to a lot of crowding and congestion in the city. So the main question here is, how do land use planning, responses to climate risks and impacts, so something very recent, actually exacerbate and create new urban social spatial inequities? This is an example of how Dhaka looks like when it's flooded. Dhaka experiences around 2,000 millimeters of rainfall annually, of which almost 80% falls during the monsoon. The main natural hazards affecting Dhaka include flood, which are associated with river water overflow as well as rainwater stagnation. The problem of Dhaka is that also 80% of the main urban area of Dhaka is low-lying, meaning that 80% of the residents are located on an area that is only 50 centimeters above sea level. That's another picture of how Dhaka looks like, congested and completely flooded during the monsoon season. And that type of flooding is recurrent. So they've been flooding 1987, 1988, 1992, 4, I mean, you name them. They've been just every 2 or 3 years, the monsoon is completely affecting basically the daily life of residents. And the main problem here is that the drainage systems are so clogged that rainwater and flooding water cannot be evacuated easily. In 1987, actually for the first time, following devastating floods in 1997 and 1998, a first climate adaptation project, which is still ongoing, has been put in place. It's called the Greater Dhaka Integrated Flood Protection Project, and it's meant to reduce flood hazard vulnerability through a very broad system of earthen embankments, pumps, and sluice gates constructed to protect a major portion of, most specifically, the more heavily urbanized area. And actually, this type of work has been awarded, so there's not only bad planning happening in Dhaka. In 2011, at the Global Water Summit in Berlin, Dhaka was awarded the Performer of the Year in terms of its water management. This is an example here of how a sluice gate looks like. The problem is that you can't just build a sluice gate, you also have to properly manage the water of the river and the canals around the sluice gate. And the problem here of Dhaka is that the fact that those gates actually most of the time closed have created a lot of waterlogging and have basically killed the biodiversity of the river and has made it even more prone to waterborne diseases during the monsoon season. So many senior architects of the city have actually asked for the removal of those gates. From an equity, from an environmental justice standpoint, the problem is that the climate adaptation planning that has taken place in Dhaka has actually put increased burden on the urban poor. Why? Because on the one hand, the system of embankments and sluice gates that I'm talking about and pumping systems has mostly taken place in the western part of the city, which is the most consolidated part of the city, where the business center takes place, rather than the eastern part of the city, where actually a lot of lower income residents tend to live. Also, the embankment has not consulted adequately residents and has led to actually major disruptions. Widespread waterlogging inside the water zone, eviction also of poor residents from canal sides and from the slopes of the embankments, and constant threats of evictions. And the problem is that the constant threats of evictions, because residents are supposed to be actually built, are actually not supposed to be living in flood-prone areas, in protected areas, all of this has actually been a disincentive for them for actually improving their housing and making it more resilient to flooding. So people have not really invested on the ground. This is an example here of how some major areas of Dhaka, which are inhabited by low-income residents, have not benefited from the Eastern Embankment project and are much more prone to flooding now. One of the main other problems of Dhaka's climate protection project is unevenness in enforcement and land use regulations and control. So what you have here is that you have a very inadequate and uncontrolled enforcement of what is a flood flow zone and what is a flood water reduction area. What I'm saying here is that in some of these areas, private developers have been allowed to come in and fill in the land to be able to construct luxury housing and actually give rise to new waves of uncontrolled investment and residents of higher income residents. They have also, through these land filling operations, altered the complete hydrology of the area that actually in many cases were areas fished by low-income communities, especially down the delta. So the livelihoods of these poor communities have been affected by also the land filling operations. And then there's also the part of the western embankment, and the road atop the embankment, so the areas that have actually benefited from the climate protection program, have actually become an access spine that has dramatically increased the pace of urban development, both inside and outside the protected area. And this is an image here of what type of projects are actually being built now on areas that are supposed to be protected and that are not supposed to be receiving new investment. So, the conclusion here is that rationalizing climate resilient land use can inequitably exacerbate the vulnerability of the poorest. There is on one hand what I call climate adaptation acts of commission, with social spatial inequities in the enforcement of zoning and in the regulations developed for risk areas. So on the one hand, poor residents are always evicted from the areas of the embankments, and at the same time, flood exacerbating projects are actually built very close to these areas for higher income residents. And then on the other hand, there's also an act of omissions by omitted to take into consideration the location of low-income residents when building the embankments. So the embankments are actually more for wealthier areas in the business district rather than the many thousands of residents, hundreds of thousands of residents living in low-lying areas of Dhaka. My last example, briefly, has to do with social and racial vulnerability in neighborhood greening initiatives, the case of Boston. The question here is, how do food privilege and food injustice get produced with the opening of so-called organic and sustainable food chains in multiracial neighborhoods? What I am studying here is the fact that environmental gentrification does not just concern new green infrastructure, parks, waterfronts. It actually also concerns food access and stores that are actually meant to enhance the affordability and the availability of fresh fruit and vegetables for low-income residents. I'm precisely targeting here the brand called Whole Foods, which is known as a natural and healthy food chain in the United States. I don't know if you have any Whole Foods here in Puerto Rico. Not yet. Don't worry, you'll have it soon. Because it's planning to come everywhere. The argument here is the fact that the arrival of such high-priced food chains transform those neighborhoods from food deserts. Are you familiar with the concept of food deserts? So desiertos de comida, to food mirages. Yes, those neighborhoods seem to have a brand new luxury supermarket selling these beautifully round and shiny tomatoes or apples, but actually who is able to purchase them is a whole other question. So this is why I'm focusing the last case study on the conflicts against the arrival of Whole Foods. That's the case of the multiracial neighborhood of Jamaica Plain in Boston that has a high proportion of blacks and Latino residents, especially around the area that's called Hyde Square. It's been historically a multiracial neighborhood, but also a gentrifying neighborhood. The main conflict emerged in 2011 when the biggest supermarket in New England, Latino supermarket of New England called Hilo, closed down and was immediately replaced by a Whole Foods market. It was a private deal between the owners of Hilo and the owners of Whole Foods, but it still triggered a massive conflict in the neighborhood. And actually this conflict is taking place, or took place, in the middle of a vast campaign against Whole Foods and its impacts on neighborhood characteristics all over the United States. This is a Facebook page of Whole Foods. Boycott Whole Foods. You are a faux hippie Walmart. You have Walmart here? Yes. Too bad. Too many. We don't have them yet in Europe, but they might also come to us. Whole Foods market workers quit in epic resignation email. So how did Whole Foods bring in new equity concerns to Jamaica Plain? And the reason why I'm focusing on this example here is that it is not a sustainability planning process managed by the city, but in the case of Boston, the city of Boston intervened to help the deal happen and actually to promote the benefit of a Whole Foods market for the entire city of Boston and for Jamaica Plain. So I consider them complicit, let's put it that way, of food gentrification. So why is it this way? Hilo was a place owned and shaped by the Latino community. The Hilo manager, who was a white man, worked very closely to residents for 40 years to source multiple hundreds of diverse Latino products from all over Latin America at wholesale prices for the residents. So when Hilo closed, residents from Latino and Black and African American origin lost reliable, cultural, and affordable food. So if you look at this is a small survey we did a few years ago, among 13 staple items, Whole Foods prices are 39% higher than Hilo, so the Latino supermarket, and also 12% higher in prices at Stop and Shop, which is kind of a full supermarket in the vicinity, but it's still more expensive by 12% than Hilo. So the closure of Hilo has put an end to easily affordable Latino food for residents. The problem here too is that the defenders of Whole Foods coming in, and there are many because there are many people believing in the importance of having a natural organic food store in the neighborhood, and I'm not against natural food store, I think they are fantastic, except that they have impacts on social spatial equity. The problem of those residents that were pro-Whole Foods is that they portrayed Hyde Square as a food desert, which was not the case at all. And so in that sense, they flattened the local food ecosystems for their own benefits. They did not recognize the fact that actually Hilo was actually bringing and fulfilling an important need for the community, for the Latino community. And at the same time, they appropriated for themselves the vocabulary of food desert, which is generally a vocabulary used for environmental justice activists to denounce an inequity in a neighborhood. So they misused it at the same time as they appropriated it. And they also imposed what is healthy food. So for instance, for them, only what is sold as Whole Foods is healthy, not what Latino residents have been practicing for decades, which is also sustainable and healthy, but they don't recognize that. They also have appropriated Latino foods from themselves. On the one hand, they want Hilo to close, but on the other hand, they praise the benefits of quinoa, yerba mate, all type of Latino spices, which actually, are spices and produce that they haven't used for many decades, but are now old fashionable. The problem is that this is what I'm calling the risk of food gentrification, meaning that little by little, the price of working class of minority staples increases through the mainstream demands and branding of them. And little by little, this type of food pricing increase excludes groups who have traditionally used them and appropriates them for foodies, what's called the foodies. So for instance, if you take one of the latest ads by Whole Foods, which is use collard greens in your daily cooking practice, the problem is collard greens, which is a type of food that is majority used by Latinos, Black residents, and also especially Brazilian residents in Boston. Instead of being sold at $1 a pound, that was the case of Hilo, is now sold at $3 a pound by Whole Foods. So by appropriating this staple and branding it as something healthy, they also increase the price. So this food gentrification is also little by little excluding people from their traditional food staples. And as I say here, and as many articles about Whole Foods explain, hipsters at Whole Foods may be hurting a lot more people than they realize. Why I'm putting all of these things from the internet is that right now, if you make a search that combines food gentrification and Whole Foods, you get 78,000 entries on Google. So there is a very, very strong relationship between the arrival of these food chains and inequities in access to affordable food. On the left, a few images of how a food desert looks like. On the right, there was more the images that Hilo had, and what benefit and what service it was providing to the Latino community. The problem of Whole Foods arrival is that actually it was accompanying a series of environmental losses in the community, which were very poignant for people. Latino food co-op closed, community gardens that were farmed by Latinos and African American residents are now farmed by white hipsters who completely misrecognize the history of the gardens being built during violence and during desegregation in Boston as a way to heal communities. The parks and the playgrounds and the ponds that are beautiful amenities in Jamaica Plain are now mostly used for white residents. The gentrifiers are the ones who benefit from new environmental amenities. And the idea here is that when you see that this is environmental privilege aggravated, you actually wonder, should we have worked in the first place on these environmental justice problems? And in the end, your answer might be no, because this is a form of regressive environmental justice. All of the achievements that environmental justice activists had gained in Jamaica Plain, you know, these high-low store, the parks, the playgrounds, the community gardens are being wiped out by the accelerated process of gentrification and by what I call here supermarket greenlining. The concept of greenlining, in a way, changes what was called in the United States redlining, the fact that some areas of neighborhoods were marked for not being good areas to insure, to give loans to invest into, and supermarkets did the same. They fled the center areas of cities for the suburbs in the 1980s. Now they are coming back and they are doing this process of greenlining, meaning neighborhoods that are racially mixed but are changing, that are getting high environmental qualities, are branded and are used by Whole Foods for their profit-making potential. And this supermarket greenlining is both an act of targeting certain types of neighborhood for their profit potential with an outcome, meaning that the price of culturally affordable food is actually being increased. Whole Foods embodies a hip, eclectic sort of vibe that feels like a Berkeley revival with no credit limit. Whole Foods arrival sends a message to developers, sends a message to public officials that the neighborhood is changing. This is called the Whole Foods effect. And in Jamaica Plain, new luxury housing developments have been announced in the vicinity of Whole Foods. And just in 1 year, between 2013 and 2014, prices of real estate in the 5 blocks around Whole Foods have increased by 10%, which is huge in a neighborhood where 70% of the residents are renters. Just to finish, a few quotes on the colorblindness of healthy food activists. I could go to Whole Foods and pack a meal full of sugar and cream. The important question is how you cook the food. I could make something healthy from high-low. We were battling constantly these insults of white-dominated institutions. There is no acknowledgement that low income are very good at sustainable patterns to stay in JP. You already do something that is sustainable, you are creative. That is the word of Norma, who was a member of the Who's Food Coalition, not Whole Food, Who's Food Coalition, which was fighting Whole Foods. I'm going to pass on that one. So, final slides. The discussion on this, what I would like to argue here is that food gentrification reveals the instrumentalization of environmental goods and natural food for the privilege of higher and wider classes. Green gentrification in the form of high-end natural health stores recreates new form of environmental inequities that actually, as I was saying earlier, had disappeared in JP. So it's a crazy cycle of getting, having brown contaminated waste sites, getting rid of them, improving the environmental quality, and then now actually having a new form of exclusion and actually regressive environmental justice. The Whole Foods effect illustrates the progression from supermarket redlining to supermarket greenlining. Activists who are against Whole Foods arrival are actually still fighting the imaginary, if you think about it, that green equals white and middle class. So the conclusions of the entire presentation, and of a play on words, through initiatives that are supposed to green neighborhoods, make them more sustainable, climate resilient, with higher access to healthy and natural foods, we are also invisibilizing the process of whiteness. The displacement of residents over time being either through the fact that rents are getting higher, that residents do not have the right to live there anymore, or that actually the entire neighborhood is changing identity, is accompanied by green and white arrival. But the racial aspect of whiteness is invisibilized by the word green. As new housing often accompany greening, the main problem is that developers and also the people who buy new housing in these developments are banking on an identity, advertising this neighborhood is diverse, has this wonderful Latino vibe, you name it, actually banking on identity that they are little by little erasing by coming in and by affecting the affordability of the neighborhood. So they are ultimately reshaping and sacrificing the sites where the local identity that they love so much is best represented. Traditional environmental justice concerns were about fighting the siting of brown facilities in marginalized neighborhoods, and pointed at dominant institutions for treating marginalized groups as if they do not deserve to live in healthy neighborhoods. Green gentrification is the flip side of this process, through which the urban poor and the people of color are only now, if you think about it, allowed to live in less green neighborhoods that are actually where they have to live because their own neighborhood is being gentrified. And their neighborhoods where they have to move has poor access to a variety of fresh and affordable food, job safety, and in the end, green space. This is just a summary graphic that is putting together all the thoughts here. Locally unwanted land uses where toxic, vacant lots, sources of contamination, they then became brownfield to the process of cleanup and revitalization. Land has been regenerated. Then it also became greener and brought together new environmental goods. The problem is that the rent gap that was created by, the toxic waste sites and the brownfields is now being filled by reinvestment and redevelopment, bringing together gentrification and displacement. Thus, as I've been arguing, making new environmental goods in neighborhood of color, locally unwanted land uses. Few dilemmas for activists and urban justice activists. How can environmental justice groups adapt their activism to municipal plans and decisions that pour in new resources to greening historically marginalized places? What do you do? How do you actually involve yourself with decision makers? Should you or not be advocating for a revitalized park or for an expanded waterfront, if you know that actually you're going to be outplaced by them? How can they also confront the apolitical or post-political and technocratic discourse of sustainability and reassert the social dimensions of the sustainability concept, which has been completely eradicated? And how can they prevent community displacement once revitalization has occurred? What policies should they be advocating for? And I'm not going to go over the last one because I've already bored you too long. But thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be here. Yes. Tell me a bit who you are too, so that I know at least who I'm talking to.
Sí, bueno, Luis Villanueva, aquí con explicación de ciencias ambientales. En cuanto al caso que usted dijo de Medellín, no sé si podría un poquito el trasfondo político, porque contrasta un poco, por lo menos en mi mente, con el caso de Bogotá, donde estaba Peñalosa y Mocus, que tiene un discurso de inclusión en estas áreas públicas, así que no sé si podría hablar un poquito del trasfondo político y quiénes son los que están con esta agenda del cinturón verde.
Vale. No conozco los otros casos de Medellín, entonces, de Colombia, entonces no te podría comparar. Lo que no quiero dar como impresión es que estos casos sean solo allá con la dimensión política de transformar los barrios y crear exclusión. Yo creo que son iniciativas importantes, iniciativas buenas, porque hay riesgos de deslizamientos, hay riesgos verdaderos. El problema es el momento en el que decides quién tiene que irse, quién se puede quedar, quién grupo y quién está detrás de estas decisiones políticas. Entonces, claro, si tienes inversores que están vinculados con la alcaldía, si tienes un boom de la construcción que da miles de empleo, claro que tienes intereses políticos detrás. Y creo que para Medellín ha tenido un pasado tan traumático y la gente ha sido tan traumatizada que, claro, usar el verde como objeto de curar también este trauma, creo que es algo muy valuable, muy importante. Lo que pasa es que si al mismo tiempo no escucha la voz de la gente o dices, vale, te voy a incluir en el proceso de planificación del corredor verde, pero que completamente ignoras todos los planes de desarrollo comunitario que existen en algunas de los barrios más desfavorecidos de Medellín, que proponen alternativas a estar removidos y que por ejemplo tienen ideas de cómo mitigar el riesgo dentro de la comunidad sin tener que que moverse. Yo creo que esto es el problema político, la ignorancia a veces de procesos participativos que podrían hacer que tu iniciativa sea un poquito más equitativa. Pero ¿tú tenías otra cosa quizás en la mente o quizás conoces la situación mejor que yo ahora?
No, eso básicamente, un poquito de trasfondo.
Sí.
I make an assumption regarding environmental injustice that perhaps is wrong. So my question is perhaps in two parts. If my assumption is wrong, I'd like you to correct me. And if it's not wrong, wonder what the solution is. The assumption that is that the Human Rights Council of the United Nations appears not to consider very much, at least in the sources that I have access to, these very serious injustices, including discrimination against people of color globally in places like Brazil and even Cuba, with some of my Cuban friends, and although perhaps the situation is most obvious against people of color with respect to Caucasians, even discrimination of Caucasians against Caucasians in Europe, Asians against Asians in Asia, and people black Africans against black Africans in Africa. And if indeed my assumption is correct, if it's not, please correct me, what would you suggest to remedy this situation where it seems to me an international effort is indicated and doesn't seem to be occurring? Or, again, maybe I'm wrong on that as well.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I don't know enough the United Nations documents and internal policies of the agencies, but I think you're absolutely right. What I didn't talk about at all here in this presentation is the existence of a global environmental justice movement. It's not organizations that are not all connected to each other. They don't use the same vocabulary. I mean, environmental justice is very specific to the history of the United States. However, there have been groups that were already in contact with each other regarding the mobilization against violations in indigenous territories, against oil and mining extraction, against forestry extraction in the 1970s and 80s. And Bob Bullock, who was the founder of the environmental justice movement, traveled to Brazil, traveled to South Africa to kind of spread the discourse of environmental justice. So this movement has been in existence for a while globally. And I think now, around certain themes, you can see global alliances. So alliances of people affected by dams, the alliances regarding water rights, indigenous people affected by mining and oil extraction. So I think that there is a movement widely known and that with organizations connected and going to the World Social Forum together, going to COP negotiations together. What is not in existence in this movement against green gentrification, because it's kind of the next step, where people are just slowly unraveling the dynamics on the ground and groups realizing, shoot, all of what we've done for 20 years might be completely eradicated now because our neighborhoods might be marketed for its greening and its beauty for others than for us. Sure. Yeah. ¿El técnico,
Julio Verdejo, egresado de la Escuela de Planificación. Gracias a usted por la presentación y a la escuela por la actividad. Me quedé pensando en el último punto, ¿no? En qué políticas pueden ser efectivas para evitar estos asuntos. Y pensaba en que se convierte en un círculo vicioso en que los municipios, las ciudades, necesitan financiar sus estructuras, los servicios que brindan, y buscan revitalizar en una forma de espacios públicos de calidad y espacios verdes, para entonces traer nuevos residentes con mayores ingresos en tiendas como Whole Foods, y aquí pues pienso en Walmart, en Walgreens y en CVS. Para financiar...
CVS is not an agent of gentrification.
Para financiar, básicamente, pero ¿cómo se sale entonces las ciudades de ese círculo? Porque entonces hay políticas de elaboramiento para atraer comunidades o infraestructura de vivienda para comunidades o residentes de bajos ingresos, pero en otras partes, ¿cómo podría impedir una ciudad de que un hipster se mude a la calle Loíza, un sector de San Juan que se está convirtiendo en un área de muchos restaurantes y mucha actividad comercial nueva? Pero como el municipio entonces le dice, hey, hipster, no me desplaces en la familia de inmigrantes que ha vivido aquí que rescató este espacio, ¿no? O sea que es un proceso de mercado, pero también es un proceso social, que en esa parte social es un poquito difícil de agarrar.
Sí. No, pones énfasis en un punto esencial, que es que las ciudades, especialmente en Estados Unidos, tienen que financiarse. Tienen muy poco ingresos del Estado federal o del Estado de los estados. Entonces, al final, todos los ingresos que puedan obtener, mejor para financiar las escuelas, los pisos sociales, etc. Yo creo que al final es una política, estábamos justo hablándolo con colegas en una conferencia en Miami que se llama Urban Affairs Associations, no sé si algunos de vosotros vais, pero es una muy buena, que os animo a ir, que al final es una cuestión de política de vivienda, creo al final, que hay que encontrar modelos de vivienda donde hay vouchers, estos cupones, creo que se llaman exclusionary zoning, housing cooperatives, quizás también límites a los precios de alquiler. Es que al final, si la gente no se puede quedar porque sus viviendas, digamos, no pueden alquilar o no pueden comprar vivienda, tiene que ser una política de vivienda, que hay muchos ejemplos interesantes también en Europa. El problema es que también la gente se va porque ve que un barrio cambia demasiado, entonces no se va porque está expulsada, sino porque ve que hay estos trastornos identitarios que no quiere vivir. Y esto lo veía mucho en Jamaica Plain cuando hacía mis entrevistas, y la gente decía, yo me he ido no porque ya no podía quedarme en el barrio, porque al final cobraba bastante, había hecho estudios superiores, pero me fui porque no me gustaba ver mi barrio tan gentrificado. Entonces, claro, eso es otro problema. Entonces, como quizás tienes otras políticas que tienen que ver con business development, workforce training, para que los businesses que se queden y que se crean en los barrios gentrificados, también o en proceso de gentrificación, se queden para los residentes tradicionales que han estado allá, que no solo sea un coffee shop que hipsters están desarrollando, sino que quizás también sea un coffee shop que venda productos orgánicos, pero que sea algo que está manejado, y también después los ingresos para grupos, para people of color, por ejemplo. Entonces esto tiene también que ver con la identidad del barrio. ¿Sí? Ya, porque es un poco negativa la presentación, ¿no? Me pone un poco triste a todos, con razón. El ejemplo del que no he hablado, pero que has citado un poquito, que también el libro tiene, que es el ejemplo de Dudley Street en Boston, es muy interesante porque Dudley tiene este ejemplo que es el Land Trust, que es otra parte de Housing Policy, que permite que la vivienda se quede, digamos, en manos de un land trust, entonces que evite procesos de especulación, pero también de foreclosure, no sé cómo se dice. Fideicomiso, imagínate la palabra que he aprendido. El proceso de fideicomiso. Entonces, esto permite que la propiedad se quede asequible para todos. Y entonces lo que tienen, que es súper interesante ahora, es lo que llaman el food incubator. Es decir, que en vez de convertir todo lo que eran antiguas warehouses en lofts, que esto pasa en muchas ciudades, antiguos desarrollos industriales en lofts, lo convierten en lugares que son laboratorios de comida, en el sentido de que se hacen muchas iniciativas interesantes como cooperativas de comida, food trucks, training alrededor de comida orgánica, catering, hecho por población afroamericana, por ejemplo, donde tienen un warehouse enorme que han subdividido en mini laboratorios con iniciativas súper interesantes que van desde la capacitación de gente en, como lo decía, en cultivar de manera orgánica, pero también en hacer preparación de comida, vender la comida, diferentes circuitos de comida, todo alrededor de una base semi-industrial, digamos. Entonces la idea es no erradicar completamente el pasado industrial, sino usarlo para que el barrio mismo, los residentes del barrio sean capacitados y reciban apoyo técnico para también diversificar la economía local, todo a base de comida orgánica que también se produce dentro del barrio, porque Dudley tiene 3 urban farms, por ejemplo. Entonces es usar el pasado industrial para convertirlo en algo un poco más verde, lo que otros académicos han llamado just green enough, no completamente verde, un poquito verde.